Tonight begins with a moment that landed hard, not because it introduced something new, but because it echoed something old and heavy and unresolved. On January 23rd, members of the British Parliament reacted publicly to remarks made by former US President Donald Trump. The reaction crossed party lines. That detail matters, because it tells us something about the nature of what was said and about how it was received. Trump's remarks centered on NATO forces and their role in Afghanistan. Specifically, he said that NATO troops avoided frontline combat during the conflict. That statement, as spoken, became the focus of condemnation in the United Kingdom. British MPs described those remarks as offensive. They did not qualify that reaction lightly. They spoke in reference to the sacrifices made by Allied forces during the Afghanistan war, and they spoke collectively from across the political spectrum. One member of Parliament described the comments in visceral terms. "Makes my flesh creep." It is a short phrase, it does not add facts, but it communicates impact. That reaction did not emerge in a vacuum. Trump's comments arrived as part of broader tension surrounding his critiques of NATO, critiques about its role, its reliability, its value. Those tensions have existed before. They have surfaced in different forms. But on this date, January 23rd, the focus narrowed sharply to the experience of NATO troops in Afghanistan. For British lawmakers, that experience is not abstract. It is defined by service, by loss, by shared military commitment alongside allies. So when the former US president suggested that NATO troops avoided frontline combat, MPs responded not with procedural language, but with moral clarity. They framed the remarks as an affront, not to policy, but to people. And that distinction is important. This was not a debate about strategy. It was not a dispute over numbers or deployments or timelines. It was about recognition and about what is acknowledged and what is dismissed when leaders speak. One MP, responding publicly, underscored that Allied forces faced danger and sacrifice throughout the conflict. That reality, they argued, stands in direct contrast to the claim that NATO troops stayed away from frontline fighting. Another lawmaker emphasized that the remarks were not merely inaccurate, but deeply disrespectful. Again, not framed as a political disagreement, framed as a reaction to how service is characterized. Across party lines, MPs expressed the same core concern, that the comments minimized the experiences of those who served, and by doing so crossed a line. There was no effort to soften the response, no hedging. The condemnation was direct. It is worth pausing here, because moments like this can blur together. Another statement, another reaction, another cycle. But this one stands out because of who responded and how. Members of Parliament from multiple parties chose to speak in unison. They did not wait for party leadership. They did not couch their words in diplomatic ambiguity. They spoke plainly. "You don't erase sacrifice," one MP said in essence through their reaction. And another put it more starkly, "This matters." Those words, even when paraphrased, point to a shared understanding. That military service, especially in a conflict like Afghanistan, carries weight. And that public statements about that service carry consequences. Trump's remarks were part of a larger pattern of criticism aimed at NATO. That context was not lost on British lawmakers. They understood the statement not as an isolated comment, but as part of an ongoing narrative questioning the alliance. Still, their response remained focused. They did not broaden the critique unnecessarily. They returned, again and again, to the same point. That NATO troops did fight, that they did face combat, and that suggesting otherwise was wrong. There are some things you don't rewrite, one MP's reaction seemed to convey, and another echoed the sentiment with a quiet firmness that did not require elaboration. The date matters. January 23rd, a specific moment, a specific response, because it anchors this reaction in time. It is not a retrospective condemnation. It is immediate. And that immediacy reflects how deeply the remarks resonated. For MPs, the issue was not about defending NATO as an institution. It was about defending the record of those who served under its banner. Men and women whose experiences were being publicly characterized. That distinction shaped the tone of the condemnation. It was emotional but restrained, forceful but focused. One lawmaker's phrase lingered in the coverage, "Makes my flesh creep." It is not policy language, it is human language. And that may be why it stuck. As this reaction unfolded, it underscored a broader truth about political discourse. Words matter, especially when they touch on shared sacrifice. The comments and the response to them sit at the intersection of politics, memory, and accountability. They remind us that how leaders speak about the past can reverberate far beyond the moment. And for British MPs on that January day, the reverberation was immediate. They spoke not as partisan actors, but as representatives responding to what they saw as a mischaracterization of reality, a reality shaped by years of conflict and cooperation. This isn't abstract, one might say, and the reaction made clear that for them, it never was. The condemnation was unanimous in tone, if not in voice. and it set the stage for a deeper examination of what was said, why it mattered, and how it fits into ongoing tensions surrounding NATO. We begin here because this is where the response began, with offense taken, with lines drawn, and with a clear signal that this was not going to pass quietly. As one MP's reaction implied, softly but firmly, some things deserve to be defended. As the day unfolded, the reaction inside Westminster did not dissipate. It intensified, not in volume but in clarity. Members of Parliament continued to respond to the remarks attributed to the former US President. And as they did, a pattern emerged. Different parties, different political histories, but the same core objection. They were not parsing language for advantage. They were addressing what they described as an affront to lived experience. Trump's claim that NATO troops avoided frontline combat in Afghanistan struck at something specific. Not a policy debate, not a budget line, but the record of service itself. MPs emphasized that Allied forces were present in dangerous conditions throughout the conflict. They spoke of risk without dramatizing it. They referenced sacrifice without embellishment, and in doing so, they framed the issue narrowly and deliberately. This was about accuracy and about respect. One lawmaker described the comments as deeply upsetting. Another said they were offensive in light of what Allied soldiers endured. Again and again, the language returned to the same theme. This was not about politics as usual. This was about how service is acknowledged. Across party lines, MPs made clear that the Afghanistan conflict involved shared commitments. British forces and NATO allies operated together. They faced the same dangers. They bore the same losses. So when Trump's remarks suggested avoidance of frontline combat, MPs rejected that characterization outright. They did not hedge. They did not qualify. This isn't theoretical, one response conveyed. It happened. That insistence on reality grounded the condemnation. MPs were not responding to an abstract critique of NATO. They were responding to a statement about what soldiers did or did not do. And in their view, the statement was wrong. The broader context hovered in the background. Trump has previously questioned NATO's role and reliability. Those critiques have been part of ongoing tensions, but MPs chose not to litigate those broader arguments in this moment. Instead, they focused on the immediate claim and its implications. By doing so, they avoided escalation. They did not speculate about motive. They did not predict future consequences. They simply said, this is not accurate and it is not acceptable. That restraint is notable because it signals intent. They were not trying to win a political exchange. They were trying to correct the record. One MP speaking publicly said the remarks disregarded the sacrifices made by Allied forces. That word, disregarded, carried weight. It implies omission rather than attack. But omission can still cause harm. Another lawmaker framed the issue as one of honor, not in a ceremonial sense, but in the sense of acknowledging reality. The condemnation did not rely on statistics. It did not enumerate deployments or battles. It did not need to. The shared understanding inside Parliament was enough. NATO troops were present. They faced combat. That is the factual foundation MPs defended. In this way, the reaction became almost instructional. It modeled how to respond to a statement seen as mischaracterizing the past, not with exaggeration, not with insult, but with firm correction. One phrase continued to circulate in coverage. Makes my flesh creep. It was quoted and repeated because it captured emotion without excess. It did not accuse. It did not argue. It expressed discomfort so strong it became physical, and that expression resonated. As MPs spoke, they made clear that this was not about defending NATO as an abstract alliance. It was about defending the people who served under its framework. That distinction matters because institutions can be debated. Service, once rendered, cannot be undone. The Afghanistan conflict remains a sensitive subject in the United Kingdom. It is tied to memory, to loss, to long years of engagement. So when MPs responded on January 23rd, they were responding not only as politicians, but as custodians of that memory. They did not claim unanimity on all aspects of the war. They did not suggest agreement on every decision made. They focused on one narrow claim, and they rejected it. Another MP emphasized that Allied soldiers did not have the option to avoid danger, that the conditions of the conflict did not allow for such distance. Again, this was not an argument, it was a statement. The condemnation also revealed something about parliamentary norms. Cross-party agreement is not automatic. It is often hard-won. But on this issue, there was little daylight. The response was collective. That collectivity gave the condemnation weight. It signaled that this was not a partisan maneuver. It was a defense of shared history. Trump's remarks were described as part of broader tensions regarding NATO's role and reliability. That context was acknowledged, but not expanded. MPs did not speculate on future implications for the alliance. They did not forecast diplomatic consequences. They stayed with the present moment, with the claim made, and with their response to it. This isn't something you gloss over, one reaction implied, and another echoed, you don't just let that stand. The choice to speak publicly was itself significant. MPs could have issued quiet statements. They could have deferred. Instead, they chose visibility, they chose clarity, and in doing so, they reinforced a boundary. That commentary on military service must be grounded in fact. As the responses accumulated, the tone remained consistent, measured, firm. There was no escalation into personal attack, no rhetorical spiral, just repetition of the same message. NATO troops fought. They did not avoid the front line. That repetition was purposeful. It ensured that the response could not be misread. One MP summed it up with a simple observation. These were real people. It is a short phrase. It adds no new information, but it grounds the discussion. Real people served. Real people faced danger. Real people were being talked about. That grounding shaped the remainder of the reaction. It kept the focus narrow, and it kept the condemnation disciplined. As coverage continued, it became clear that this was not a fleeting moment. It was a response rooted in principle. MPs were not reacting to provocation for its own sake. They were asserting a shared baseline of truth. And in that assertion, they closed ranks. The remarks had been made, the reaction had followed, and the message from Parliament was unambiguous, that mischaracterizing Allied service crosses a line. As one MP's words suggested, quietly but firmly, some things are settled. The response taken together did not seek to inflame, it sought to correct. And that distinction will matter as we move to how this moment concludes, how the condemnation fits into the broader tension, and what it signals about how history is defended when it is publicly questioned. By the end of January 23rd, the reaction from British members of Parliament had settled into something unmistakable. Not outrage, not spectacle, but resolution. The remarks made by the former US president were not reframed. They were not absorbed into a larger debate and diluted. They were answered directly and then left to stand against the response they provoked. MPs across the political spectrum had said what they needed to say. They had condemned the claim that NATO troops avoided frontline combat in Afghanistan, and they had done so by anchoring their response to one central point, that the sacrifices of Allied forces were real, and that those sacrifices deserved to be acknowledged accurately. There was no attempt to escalate the moment further, no calls for retaliation, no speculation about what the remarks might mean in the future. Instead, Parliament's response functioned almost like a closing statement, clear, contained, final. The comments were described as offensive. That word was used deliberately. It does not imply confusion, it implies violation. For MPs, the violation lay in the gap between what was said and what they knew to be true about the conflict in Afghanistan. They spoke as lawmakers, but also as representatives of a country that had participated in that conflict alongside NATO allies. And in doing so, they made something else clear. This was not about defending a political position. It was about defending a factual record. Trump's critique of NATO, including questions about its role and reliability, was acknowledged as part of the broader backdrop. But MPs did not widen the frame unnecessarily. They did not revisit past disputes. They did not forecast future tensions. They kept their response anchored to the claim itself, that NATO troops avoided frontline combat, and they rejected it. One MP, reflecting the tone of many others, made it plain that Allied soldiers did not have the luxury of distance from danger. That service in Afghanistan involved exposure to risk. That reality, they argued, was not subject to reinterpretation. Another lawmaker emphasized that the remarks disregarded years of cooperation and shared burden. Again, the language was careful, measured. The response did not rely on emotional escalation. It relied on repetition of fact. That repetition over the course of the day became its own form of emphasis. It ensured that the message was not lost. NATO troops were present. They faced combat. They did not avoid the front line. By the time the reaction had fully registered, it had accomplished something specific. It had drawn a line, not a political line, a historical one. This is what happened. This is how it is remembered. And this is how it will be defended when questioned. The condemnation also revealed something about how institutions respond to perceived mischaracterization. Parliament did not convene an emergency session. There was no formal resolution. Instead, individual MPs spoke, and their voices aligned. That alignment was not orchestrated. It emerged. Across parties, lawmakers used similar language. They referenced sacrifice. They referenced service. They avoided embellishment. One phrase continued to resonate as coverage concluded. "Makes my flesh creep." It remained the most quoted reaction. It is not a policy statement. It does not require interpretation. It conveys discomfort so immediate that it bypasses analysis. And perhaps that is why it mattered. The phrase did not introduce new facts. It did not change the substance of the debate, but it captured how deeply the remarks landed. As the day moved on, there was no further amplification from Parliament. Now, the condemnation stood on its own. It did not need reinforcement. The MPs who spoke had made their position clear. They had defended the record of Allied forces. They had rejected the claim that those forces avoided danger. And they had done so without adding speculation or extending the argument beyond its bounds. That restraint is part of what gives the response its weight. It signals confidence in the facts being defended. There was no need to persuade, only to state. Trump's comments remained part of his broader critique of NATO. That context did not change, but the reaction from British lawmakers ensured that, at least on this point, the record was publicly corrected, not rewritten, corrected. The Afghanistan conflict is complex. Its legacy is contested in many ways, but the participation of NATO troops and the risks they faced is not in dispute among those who served and those who represented them. That shared understanding is what MPs defended. As the coverage closed, it became clear that this moment would not be remembered for escalation. It would be remembered for clarity. A claim was made, a response followed, and the response was unified. One MP's reaction summed it up with quiet finality. This isn't something you forget. It is a simple sentence. It adds nothing new, but it reflects why the reaction mattered, because memory matters, and because how leaders speak about shared sacrifice carries weight beyond the moment. By the end of January 23rd, Parliament had said its piece. The condemnation had been delivered. The record had been defended. And with that, the moment closed. Not with resolution of broader tensions, but with a clear statement of fact. And sometimes that is the point.